Okay, ladies and gentlemen, ever so sorry to interrupt you. Like I said, I do hate to jump into the middle of what I'm sure have been very engaging and interesting conversations. But I assure you, you can continue them soon after. But we wanted to take a couple of minutes now to the end of the session so that we can share a little bit of the output or the input that each of the think tanks have discussed, so that you can share it a bit with the other delegates here at the conference. Obviously, this is just a quick summary. The idea of these think tanks is that they're offline, that it's a chance for you to talk more intimately, more privately about some of these subjects. But now let's just share some of the key highlights from each one. So if we can start, I'm going to ask the service parts table. Antonio, maybe will you do the summary, if that's okay? Will you give? Yeah. So we'll start with Antonio Taranto for our aftermarket and service parts table. And so, Antonio, if you can just give us a short summary of some of the key problems and solutions that you guys have discussed.
Quem fala em português?
Well, I'm going to speak in Portuguese. We had a very interesting debate because we have all the logistic partners at our table, and we were talking here about why we deliver vehicle cars with all brands, but the parts are all separate. Each one has a different logistic company, and at the end, all the distributors are in the same street. They're in the same area. So we were discussing that there is a very large, a very big opportunity to improve this distribution, whether it be time-wise for the client, so to decrease the transit time because you're going to have a truck with a frequency, loaded frequency which is faster than today. And the big debate here was precisely to work in cooperative logistics. So we discussed the details that the companies, they work completely separate from each other, and the logistic providers also work completely separate. Everyone fighting with everyone else, everyone wanting to gain the key accounts of Volkswagen, Nissan, GM, etc., when in reality we should have a cooperative logistic where it would come out from the manufacturing plants. Typical examples were discussed. For example, you have a warehouse of some manufacturers in the northeast of the country, so the parts go from here there, and then you also have in the state of Rio Grande do Sul, for example, you have a manufacturer in Paraná, also in the interior of São Paulo, in Rio you have different plants, and each one distributes only their own parts. I can guarantee you that 60–70% of the parts are common to all vehicles. We also discuss two systems of spare part, which, for example, a simple maintenance of a car, when you change a filter for oil or you change parts of the brakes or something, all these parts could work with the distributors as a normal replenishment, distributor by distributor, transforming each distributor in a sequence or in a warehouse for the warehouses, which normally the plants they have this inventory themselves. So instead of having this inventory, the plants having this inventory should go straight with the order, do a sort of a cross-docking, and delivering there in that tiny town in Rio Grande do Sul where all the dealers are. Especially when we talk about maintenance parts, because all the cars need this, and the specification for the market, filters, brake parts, etc., this percentage is even higher for the cars. The other one would be the repair market, let's say a collision or something, then you would have to order the parts. And so the conclusion of our team was, on the manufacturing side, it's very clear that we need this synergy, but the plants don't believe that the cost reduction is going to be passed over to the plants. Is that clear? So, on the other hand, the service providers also, they have reached the conclusion that for this to work, unfortunately, you'll have to have one service provider for everyone, or perhaps a joint venture, who knows, to do this service. But the discussion was all focused on transparency and on the reduction of the costs, and if the client really is going to benefit. We also talked about client satisfaction, that the spare parts with distributors, and sometimes the plant hasn't requested this part, so the supplier hasn't manufactured. And we thought, well, perhaps this simple logistics of maximum, minimum inventory at the distributor, it would make things easier.
Great discussion. I thought a lot of interesting ideas, a lot of focus on collaboration, building trust and transparency, ultimately doing what would be best for the customer, which is perhaps not how the current supply chains are engineered. We'll move on to our second group here. This was lessons learned, and I think Fabrizio from Penske, you can give us a summary of what you discussed.
Bom, eu acho que vou tentar sumarizar.
I'm going to try and summarize our talk. Our talk was a long chat. I think that what Tarento mentioned now is very important, because what was the idea in our discussion table? It was precisely to understand and discuss about all this process that we've undergone in this crisis, a crisis which we hope that we're leaving. We had to reinvent, increase production. We had a huge cost reduction, but on the logistics side, especially today, logistics transport, a lot of the empty trucks, the reduction of costs, this happened. How can I call this? It wasn't just an adjustment of production. It was not just not using a truck. A lot of transport companies, they had to close down, they had to get rid of their drivers, they became idle. So now that we're sort of starting up again, we can see that the structure is not prepared to absorb these volumes. We see, for example, tariffs going up, things that we weren't expecting. Now the guy's there, he stopped with his truck. Now the guy doesn't exist anymore, the company's closed. So this was the same, the theme of our discussion, not to lose everything that we gained during this crisis period. And then on the same line, we also talked a lot about collaboration. So last year, we had a roundtable discussion when we talked about that the focus was collaborative work. This is something that's very important. We see difficulty in implementing this. We started a project that was born here of freeing a collaborative logistic committee with several plants, several suppliers, and we had a lot of people joining, people come with the spirit of we have to do things, but when we really started putting it into practice, we saw that few companies joined the bandwagon. And then when we had a few more companies coming in, the implementation was extremely difficult in real life. First of all, a legal concern, especially the manufacturers, and this being looked at as a cartel, for example, and also difficulty of people stopping to analyze this, or to be able to have time to participate in meetings, because the structures now are much smaller, leaner, because the person that was doing this was involved in something else to prove cost reduction in some other area. So this initiative last year, we were hoping to show a super case this year, and during this 1 year, concrete what we were able to do, not even implement, but we were able to identify and move towards the implementation of one route between two automakers, which we were able. So the biggest challenge that we have is how to really do things different, how to be able to benefit from this in an effective way. We talked also that we're beginning to live through again what went on in 2009, 2010, that sort of after that peak that we had in 2013, where the volume started to go up and the structure wasn't ready for that. So at that time, everyone spent more, everyone had to adequate themselves, and it seems that we didn't learn a lot because now we're going to relive everything again. So I think this issue of how much companies are open to this partnership concept was a response that we did not reach, because the general vision is that everyone wants it, but when you put it into practice, it's difficult and you can't make it happen. And how much companies are willing to work in this collaboration profile, knowing that collaboration means that you're not always going to win. Sometimes you might lose for your partner to win, but at the end, everyone needs results. And when you talk about finance, it's not, you can't justify it internally. Sometimes I'm going to contract a higher capacity with a partner because I'm betting on this or that. I might have to spend a bit more, and the issue is, well, I need this, prepare yourself for that, and if the volume is not there, well, it's your bad luck. So that's what we see on our day-to-day routine. Another point that we also discussed was that we see this issue of collaboration working a bit better in other segments. So we gave some examples here. For example, electronic industry. Today they share much more resources, especially production-wise. We have large OEMs of electronics products that they manufacture the main the main products for all brands. They make for Apple, for Samsung, for HP, and no company is worried that his competition is sharing that space. It was a way that they managed to live and compete at the same time. So I think the electronics industry is an example that we have to study deeper, and how other segments can also be studied as reference for automakers. And last but not least, we discussed the topics of now, for example, with this new labor laws that we have in Brazil. I asked if any company was applying this effectively in the companies, this business of intermittent work, with a variation of volume, if we can adequate this to the new legislation. But the general feeling is that this is not really happening in companies yet. The companies have not yet upgraded to this new model, and in the Brazilian style, I think, well, now that the law really is applicable, we'll check out to see how it works. But no one prepared themselves for this, so no processes have been altered. So to summarize, I think once more, the idea that everyone knows what has to be done, but we really need different action from all the companies changing the mindset. Otherwise, in 10 years, we'll be talking and saying the same thing. Remember in 2020, when the volumes went up, we weren't prepared, etc., etc. I think that was what we discussed.
Overlap in terms of the collaboration and the need to work more closely. Unfortunately, some of those lessons still to be learned, as we heard, and I hope it doesn't take another crisis to get there. But let's hope in the recovery we see progress. Interesting points on the regulation as well. We're going to move on now to our third group, vehicle transportation, vehicle logistics transportation. I'm going to ask Christoph Seitz from CFR Rinkens to summarize for us.
Hello, everybody. Our company is specialized in transporting finished vehicles in containers, and we just started our first lane to Brazil. And in the process of setting up that operation, you know, I'm from Germany, but I live in the U.S., and was my first time really digging into the specifics of Brazil. And one of the things that crystallized really quickly was that Brazil has a very, let's say, difficult domestic transportation infrastructure, meaning that the delivery of vehicles on the road is really in the hands of just a few companies, and it's not an easy setup. So pricing is really high. It takes very long in some areas to deliver cars and so on. So I was curious as sort of an outsider to dig into that subject some more and finding out what is the background of that and what can be done about it. I'll take the conclusion up front. We have no conclusion. I think we talked a lot about really the need for collaboration, mainly in the area of I guess, really pressuring politics as a way to, I guess the new labor laws that have been implemented are showing some effect, and there's some hope there, but really there has to be something fundamentally changing on the side of politics in order to really change that domestic issue of domestic trucking being made so difficult. One area we talked about was who can really do something, and I've been to a lot of conferences, and it's always interesting to see the talk about collaboration and people saying we should get together and evoke some change, but it never really happens. And I think it's primarily for two reasons. One is it's very difficult for OEMs or even logistics providers to share information. A lot of times it's proprietary information and people don't really want to share that. That's understandable. I think everybody's really busy. So we had a healthy discussion about whether it should be the OEMs getting together in Brazil or whether it should be the logistics providers getting together and doing it. I think from an outsider perspective, I think if there's a country that is ripe to have real collaboration, it's really Brazil. You have a lot of issues with the infrastructure and politics and taxation and so on, and I think everybody deals with the same real problems, and it would make sense to get together here. Some other details. So, yeah, I guess Favia is the organization here in Brazil that represents the OEMs, if I understand that correctly. And there's a committee that basically could get together and could pressure politics, but that doesn't really seem to be happening. We talked about cabotage as a potential solution. But again, there seems to be a real concern about what happens if the domestic distribution model is significantly changed or tapped into to be changed. What could that mean, especially to the OEMs in terms of potential plant shutdowns and so on? So we talked about so many things. I don't want to bore everybody, but it was a very healthy discussion. I've done a few of those, and it was a very interesting subject. It seems to be a real problem. It's not just one for a think tank, but it's a real significant problem for the OEM. And let's see what happens in the next few years with politics hopefully getting better. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Christoph. I think we definitely have a theme in our think tanks, and that's sort of lack of collaboration and trying to do something to get that forward. And obviously plenty of other challenges on the vehicle logistics side we could have spent a whole conference on, I have no doubt. But thank you for sharing that. I want to move to our tier supplier. So if I can ask Jens and Esteves to summarize what we talked about here.
Bom, o nosso grupo aqui teve.
Our group had a discussion, I think a very sort of mature discussion. We discussed how we can improve our chain of supply. Starts with the automaker, tier 1, logistics provider, tier 2, tier 3. And our conclusion is that each element in this chain is important, but the main factor is to think or reflect how the supplier and do the homework. So what is the business model? If the automaker, what's the business, for example, is it stable? a stable automaker or one that has opportunity cost. So then the variation is difficult to forecast in a dynamic market such as Brazil's market. For example, where there are 22 or 21 automakers, where we used to share 4 million vehicles between 10, and now we're dividing 2.6 by 22 automakers. So it's unstable. So if I don't understand the business model, there are some that are stable, 3 models of vehicles, so there'll be no variation. I will be able to have my forecast. I'll be able to plan in a more stable manner. But I have other clients, and then I have to understand my client, and I have to work with the information that the market provides to me. So how can I work with this information? I have N5 information. I have correlations that we can make with the inflation rate, the Selic rate, the level of financing. There's several different types of information, and with transparency in relation to the automaker, we're able to forecast this better. If a decision is taken, in general, with the calculations, you can reach tier 3, 4 weeks after the decision was made. If we're able to make this happen earlier, there's no interest in any of the parts to throw away time and money, because this for sure will be passed on the chain and the final consumer will be paying. So what we discussed here was how to utilize this market information, how to come back into our companies with the stakeholders, with the people that are able to collect the information, this valuable information in the plants. Sometimes the information that comes from engineering is different from the information that comes from planning, but together we're able to reach an agreement. And so to confront what is coming in the future, I think it's different from 2009, 2010. I think that we are much more prepared now. I think this idea of spending a little bit, I think when the crisis started, we struggled a lot. No, let's keep the people. The market is going to come back, and we were losing money, and in the end we thought, well, when the market comes back, then we'll spend. And I tell you, when it comes back, we're going to spend half of what we spent waiting for the market to come back. So I believe that what I learned and what we take home in this extremely rich discussion on this table is the following. First of all, work closer to the information. The automaker give the best information. I think another point that we discussed here, which is very important, is to know what to ask. The quality of the information, because you ask, and it was a colleague of ours who said, the market's coming back. And the company says, no, let's contract, and then it doesn't happen. So the quality of the information is important. How to relate this information. Is it correct? Who's gaining the market share? What car is selling more? Are number plates being put on vehicles? Is it a premium segment? Is it a basic segment? All this information is in our hand. The idea is to put this in an adequate equation with the correct stakeholders so that we have supply chain which is more productive. And obviously we also discuss the input of the other side, the logistics provider. Is this going to increase? Yes. What can he do? Because in the day-to-day of the tier 1 automaker, I can affirm, or I can state, it's running the whole time. And sometimes for you to have a meeting with a logistics provider, do this, hold that, this proximity with the tier 1 and the logistics provider. So our conclusion as a group is Let's understand the business model of our client. Variations will occur. It's good. I remember that when I was working, we've increased 40%. Well, this problem is the best we can have. It's the best problem. It's better than to increase than to drop 40%. So the more transparent the chain is, it'll be better for everyone. But I believe that we have to go back to our companies and see if we really understand our clients. Are we able to analyze information? Do I know what he sells, what he doesn't sell? Do I know what segment? Is he gaining market share? Is he losing? Where does he come from? Where is he located? I think that we still have space to improve. That was the conclusion. Everyone recognizes that it is possible to work with more transparency and that the market is going to react. I think the whole table is anxious and prepared for this. I hope I was able to summarize.
Thank you, Jensen. I think, again, lots of great points there, particularly understanding your customer, listening to the data and the forecasts and making the supply chain more productive in the whole process, listening to all the stakeholders, including the logistics providers. Thank you again for sharing that. Our last group here, I want to ask Vegard Sinnes from CDC to tell us about international packaging.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, so I'm with a Chinese company. Among other things, we do returnable packaging in China. And we recently started doing, we set up a packaging lane between China and Japan. So I was quite interested in looking at intercontinental packaging from discussing this here with the Brazilian crowd to see how the status is here in Brazil and hopefully figuring out what can be done to improve this segment for the future. First off, in Brazil, apparently expandable is still dominating for the import-export flows, expandable packaging that is. There's been some constraints from the authorities in the past, but apparently this is somehow getting better now. You can actually use more returnable packaging also for your export or import goods. There is, I think we figured out throughout the discussion, as it seemed like most of the other tables said as well, that there is room and there is a need for more cooperation, more collaboration across the industry if we're going to improve this segment or optimize this segment. We need to, for example, as service providers, we need to talk to each other. We need to cooperate to make sure that we have the backhaul for the different lanes we operate. We need to optimize the package utilization through this. We also need to find synergies between the packaging providers, the users, the OEMs, and also probably the manufacturers. It was also mentioned that one way to do this could potentially be to set up a new organization or a company where everyone who's involved in the supply chain has a share or has a stake in it, that to make sure that everyone is working for the best interest of the industry and or the overall situation. For these intercontinental packaging flows, we also talked a lot about information, overview, tracking solutions, that this is something that we need to improve on if the industry is kind of like get the full benefit of the packaging in general, basically. However, as it is now, you have different solutions. You have RFID, you have new cloud solutions coming up, but there is still kind of a lack of hardware. There is the industry basically hasn't gathered around one solution that we can kind of agree upon. This is what we use, and this is the standard for the industry. So we need to get there. We need to standardize more. We need to find solutions to do this. Blockchain was mentioned. Once we have the hardware part figured out, blockchain could be interesting to look at in the future for packaging management. Specifically, down you look at the intercontinental, international packaging flows. In the end, I think we kind of agreed on that we need to set up a committee or some kind of organization consisting of OEMs, of packaging providers, the authorities, industry organizations who can look at this from a joint approach, come together, figure out what needs to be done. I think we agreed that we should, in Brazil, we start with benchmarking towards Europe, which apparently is doing very good in this segment. They have 8 standardized boxes that are used in Europe. Probably the ones that are furthest on in the world when it comes to packaging. And this is something we need to look at and try to implement here as well. And from there, do this kind of country by country. I think Newton was volunteered to lead a committee here in Brazil. Now, I'm going to do the same in China. No, but anyways, we need to talk together more. We need to get together, set the standards, and then we can improve both on domestic returnable packaging, but also especially for intercontinental returnable packaging in for the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vigard. Obviously, there could be no sharing of packaging if there aren't shared standards, and that requires a lot of communication within and across organizations, and good to hear that maybe can get started, even if in a small way, just from a small think tank discussion. Thank you all for your participation in that. I hope you enjoyed it. It always turns up some interesting input, and I'm sure a lot of that which we don't necessarily capture in the summaries as well. We're going to take a quick coffee break, probably 10-15 minutes, because we want to get our panelists on stage and have a good Q&A session to finish up the conference before we go on to our gala dinner. And we want to try and stay ahead a little bit of that famous Sao Paulo traffic. So get a coffee, and we'll meet you back here in about 10-15 minutes.